Well, before I hop into the message tonight, let me also give you a little bit of an update on our next project. Next, of course, is what we're calling this effort to start all these new churches around the world and to do our building expansion. You can obviously see it's under construction. I need to say thank you both for your generosity and for your flexibility during this time. We've had to be a little bit flexible. Within the next 2 months, the project should essentially be completed and we'll be in this new space. But I found that as we get closer and closer, the conversation kind of comes to why? Why are we building a larger facility? Why are we expanding our commons? And of course, everyone knows it's because we need more room. But I always want to focus the conversation on who we need room for, right? I don't really have any desire just to have a bigger church. It doesn't do the kingdom of God any good for us to have a bigger space so people can move from one church to this church. That's not helpful at all. Instead, the very reason why we'd expand this facility, why, since you're being generous and putting up with the dust, is because there's all kinds of people in our region who are disconnected from church, who are maybe struggling with their faith, who have given up on God, who have been scarred by an experience somewhere. When you want to ask me why are we expanding our facility, that's why. And it takes me back to the time we built this facility. About 15 years ago, this was under construction. We were having the same conversation. Why build? And I don't know if you know this, but in just a couple of weeks, this carpet that's underneath your chairs, this beautiful coffee-stained carpet, is going to disappear. And for a couple weeks, we'll just have a concrete floor, and then we'll get nice new carpet that you can spill your coffee on afterwards. But once we uncover this carpet, you're going to notice there's a lot of names written on the floor underneath the carpet. Because before we moved into this facility, a lot of people came into this room. Some of you came into this room, and we wrote down the names of people that we knew, friends of ours, neighbors, coworkers, who were struggling with their faith, who were disconnected from God and church. And we wrote their names on the floor. We prayed for them as we wrote them, hoping that this could be the kind of environment. In fact, here's what I'm confident of. There's more than a few people in this room tonight whose names are on the floor. Because someone was praying for you and thinking, yeah, I could invite you. And even if your name isn't here, there's lots of you who fit the storyline of someone who would say, yeah, I was disconnected until I was welcomed here. And now I have this faith, and it's thriving, and it's beautiful. And so we're going to do that all over again this weekend, not on this floor, but we're going to actually let you go into the construction area. So right after the service tonight, we have Sharpies for everybody. And I want you to sit, if you haven't thought about it yet, and think, hey, who is it in my world that could use a church like this, where they're disconnected from faith or from God? And grab a Sharpie and write 2 or 3, just write their first names on the concrete out there. There'll be some people to direct you, but I hope that right after we get done with this service, all of us will kind of flood out there and remember why we're building this and who we want to welcome through those front doors. It'll be covered up very soon by another floor, which I hope to never destroy, okay? So let me jump into the series here. We actually only have one more week after tonight on this long BC series. 19 weeks we've been walking through the Old Testament, and I really, really hope that you'll be here next week as we complete it, because we have some special things planned as we complete the BC series. But for tonight, we're going to hear a story, again, someone from the Old Testament and this path leading up to Christ. The person that you're going to hear about in this story, if you grew up with any reference to church at all, you're going to recognize the name and a little bit of the storyline. But I think the reason this story is so important isn't just because of the wild and kind of supernatural experiences that happen within it. The important part for us might be the setting in which this story happened. And so before I get to the story today, let me describe how I think that setting will parallel our setting with a couple of observations. Here's observation number 1. Christianity seems to have a home field disadvantage. Doesn't that seem odd? Most people have a home field advantage, right? You're better when things are kind of on your turf. But one of the very fascinating things about Christianity all through history, and it's certainly true today, is that when Christianity is the underdog, when people are experiencing persecution, when they're in a setting where their faith isn't the faith, we see Christianity thrive. And then, once Christianity, in most any setting, becomes the majority or becomes aligned with the positions of power in a society, oftentimes Christianity loses its way and it starts to disintegrate and fall apart a little bit. You can see this in the early church, right after Jesus died and rose again. The church took off like wildfire. And when you see the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to all his friends who were starting new churches, they're starting them under very difficult circumstances. They're being persecuted, and yet the gospel is thriving in the first 300 years since Christ died. It thrived in incredible ways under great persecution and fear of death. And then people thought they hit a gold mine. Constantine became emperor of Rome, and he brought Christianity into the places of power of Rome and brought it into the mainstream. And everyone thought that was the answer, but it wasn't the answer. Actually, when it moved into places of power and it moved into places of dominance, people got a little fat and a little happy with their faith. And they lost their mentality to be missionaries to the world around them, and they started standing in judgment of people who weren't followers of Jesus. This happened in the Old Testament. We see the cycle. We'll see it tonight. And I think it's happening today. And one of the mistakes people make is they think, oh, if Christianity could just be dominant, if Christians could be in charge and tell everyone else to live like Christians, then we'd thrive. But it's not true. It's actually not what the scriptures describe at all. So instead, we might be at a time, even within our culture, our country, our region, where as we see Christianity not having the influence it used to have, not being in the places of power it used to have, it might be better for people of faith. I don't know if you think about it this way, but if you kind of imagine the settings you find yourself in, you may have thought at one time, hey, I live in kind of a Christian world. I live in a Christian community. I go to work at a Christian workplace. In my neighborhood, basically everybody's Christians. And certainly, that's not true. I'm not sure if it ever was true, but it's certainly not true anymore. And the setting that we're going to explore tonight is actually the setting where someone who's a follower of God is in the minority and not in power. And the question is, how do you live out your faith? And how do you speak for God when you're not on the home team? We could think about this lots of ways, but one of the ways we'd have to think about it is generationally. That if you start to segment out the generations in the United States right now, in Northwest Indiana right now, you would see that the younger the generations get, the less prone they are to embrace the faith of Christianity. So how would we live in a setting like that? Well, what we're going to learn tonight is, in the story of Daniel, is this, that among people who don't embrace faith, we represent God. Now, I don't know if you love that or if that scares you to death, but I want you to embrace it. I've been talking about 2 other R's this whole message series, that we have a relationship with God and a responsibility with Him. In a setting, if you find yourself in any setting where the people around you aren't necessarily followers of Jesus, then you represent God to them. They look at you, and however you act, and whatever you say, and however you respond, and however you love or don't love, they think, oh, that's what God is like. And there's been many examples throughout history where it was the behavior of Christians, not the gospel of Jesus, that kept people from God. Mahatma Gandhi, extraordinarily influential leader, a man with a wonderful heart and made a huge difference in this world, once explored embracing Christianity. And the most famous quote from Gandhi, from my perspective, is this: I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians seem to be nothing like your Christ. And it is the role of a believer in a world where believing isn't just automatic, to represent God wherever you are. So that's what we're going to see from the story of Daniel today. Let me set it up for you a little bit, and we'll kind of follow the whole thing through. I think as I'm reading it, you'll think, I should read my Bible more. This is a great story, right? So this happens in a setting where Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. The Babylonians have overtaken the Israelites, the people of God, the Jewish people, and now they're in what they call exile. They're kind of under the authority of the Babylonians. We'll pick up the story there. It says this, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility." So here's what's happening. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Hey, chief of staff, I want you to go get some of the best and brightest of the Israelites. And we're not going to try to put them all into slavery. We're actually going to try to assimilate them into our culture. And what we'll need to do is get some of their best and brightest, some of their leaders, some people they'll follow, assimilate those leaders into our culture, and then they'll kind of be assimilated as well." Get this. He says, "Find the ones who are young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace." Cream of the crop. He was to teach them, get this, the language and literature of the Babylonians, right? This is assimilation into the culture. We want you to become one of us. We want you to speak our language. We want you to understand our history. They had to get some haircuts. They actually had to change their names. They were being assimilated into the Babylonian culture. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were there to be trained for 3 years. This was essentially graduate school. And among the Jewish men who were selected for this were 4 people we know as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, it's very interesting what happens immediately. Daniel gets kind of drafted into this. In some ways, it's a great deal, right? He's going to get an education. He's going to get all the best. He's going to get to live in the king's quarters. But the food and wine that he was supposed to eat actually went against the dietary laws of his faith. And so he had to start to navigate something immediately to say, hey, this isn't my world, my faith, my religion isn't in charge here, but I also still want to honor my God. What am I going to do with that? And so what we get with Daniel is he actually goes to ask permission, to say, is it possible that I could just eat some vegetables and stuff? I don't need to eat the meat and the wine. And there's a little negotiation that happens. In the midst of this negotiation, Daniel says, all right, here's the deal. I get it. I need to be just as strong as everybody else. Let me do this for a certain period of time, and if I do it and I'm just as strong as everyone else, then it's good. I can just avoid this food and this wine, right? Right. Daniel kind of finds a way to stay true to his faith in the midst of living under the authority of someone who doesn't share his faith. Then the king has a dream. And you've probably noticed this as we've gone all the way through the Old Testament. These kings weren't real patient with the people underneath them. And when the king had this dream, he wanted someone to interpret his dream. And you kind of get the idea the king had asked people to interpret his dreams before, and then they said they were interpreting them, but they didn't, like it wasn't really adding up. So the king had a new plan this time. He said, I need someone to interpret my dream, but if you're smart enough to interpret my dream, you should just be able to tell me what my dream was, too. And now all of a sudden he could find no one to do this. He gets mad about it. He decides he's going to kill all the men of wisdom, the wise people. And then we have this kind of account that happens in Daniel 2. It says, when Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and with tact. Now, Daniel was one of the ones who was going to go down with this. But Daniel approaches him, and this is very important. He spoke with wisdom and with tact. Do you know how many times I've observed people who say they're followers of Jesus, and they're in an environment where there's people who aren't followers of Jesus, and they, for some reason, think the best approach to influence those who aren't followers of Jesus is basically to yell at them, to demean them, to accuse them, to tell them how wrong they are. Daniel knows nothing of that. Instead, he says, let's find some common ground. I'll speak to you with wisdom and with tact. And Daniel starts to suggest that he might be able to interpret this dream, but he has no real idea how he's going to do it. So what does Daniel do? Here's what he does. It says, then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They just had to change their names in the midst of it. So he had kind of a group of people that he shared faith with, that he knew he could go back to, kind of this band of brothers, the true friends we talked about a few weeks ago. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. Now, you can't miss this through the story of Daniel, is if you want to be a person who's living kind of on the visiting team, where your faith isn't the faith that's embraced by everyone else, but you want your faith to be embraced. It doesn't work to have a few tricks up your sleeve. It doesn't work to have some tactics. It doesn't work to be a good salesman. What you constantly have to do is put yourself in a place where God's power will be on display. I mean, maybe this is just me, but I've seen some pretty terrible tactics tried to be used by Christians, thinking they're actually helping bring others to Christ. I was actually at a restaurant once, and I was eating with someone, and I thought he was a pretty good person, and it came time to pay the bill. He was paying the bill. I thought that was awesome. I wasn't paying the bill. And then I noticed he was going to leave a tip, right, which is great. But instead of leaving a cash tip, he left a tract. Do you know what a tract is? If you don't know what a tract is, God bless you for not knowing what a tract is. But it's something that tries to explain who God is to people. And this is honestly what he thought. He thought, my waitress that I have, she needs God more than she needs a tip. And I thought, she needs a tip, right? Like, there's no trickery to this. There's not some slick new style you can use to get people into the kingdom of God. And so you know what we did? We walked out of the restaurant, and I kind of lied to him. I feel bad about this, but I'm confessing, so I feel better now. I actually walked out of the restaurant with him, and then I said, oh, you know what? I need to use the restroom. And I went back in the restaurant, and I left a nice tip and took the tract. Because that's crazy. And anyway, let me go on here. All right, so first dream, Daniel gets there. King asks Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Can you tell me what the dream was and the explanation of it? Daniel replied, no wise man, no enchanter, no magician, no diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Now, as crazy as it is to watch people who are kind of what I'd call aggressive Christians try to shove the faith down other people's throat, the opposite of it is equally lame. People who would think, because I don't want to misrepresent God, I won't represent God at all. I'll just not speak about him. I'll keep the peace. And that doesn't seem to be Daniel's approach either. He wants to name what's true. He says, listen, you don't have a guy in your kingdom. Not a magician, not somebody who's smart, not someone who even plays with kind of the black arts. They can figure this out. There's only one who knows, and I represent him. So he explains the dream and gets it right, gets some accolades for it, gets some power for it. Daniel moves up to be almost in charge of the whole Babylon section of the kingdom. He gets his 3 friends jobs that are pretty cush jobs with lots of authority, and things seem to be going great. And then his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are administrators over Babylon, and the king wants them to bow down to him. And kind of a long story, they can't. Why can't they? Because when you worship the living God, you don't bow down to anyone else. Even when the pressure's on, even when it could cost you your job, in their case, even when it could cost you your life. And they feel some pressure, some pretty direct pressure. They're warned. They say, you're going to lose your life if you don't bow down. And they decide not to bow down. And some of you know the story. The king says, I'm going to heat up the furnace. I'm going to throw you in. You're all going to die. You know what they say? These 3 men say to the king right before they go into the furnace? Here's what they say. They say, we believe our God will save us. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods. That'll get people's attention. If you won't compromise, if you'll stand by your convictions, and you're not a jerk about it, but you're not moving either. I believe what I believe, and it really matters, and even when it's going to cost me something. And you have a posture toward God that says, God, when I'm in trouble, I know you can save me, and I pray you will save me, but even if you don't save me, I'm standing for what I believe in. That's a powerful posture for a believer in the midst of unbelievers. Now, of course, if you know the story, you know that The furnace was so hot that some of the soldiers who were putting them in it died, but they actually came out unscathed. And so there is, again, this sense of Daniel's God must really matter. That moves us to dream number 2. Dream number 2, we can go like this. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now Belteshazzar, he goes and gets Daniel, the dream interpreter. Tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you can, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Right? Now this is a very fascinating phrase to me. The king obviously wants Daniel to come through for him again. He understands Daniel has access to something he doesn't have. From a theological perspective, this is a terrible phrase. Right? Like if you're just a person who wants to get every theological thing exactly right, and the king says, the spirit of the holy gods is in you, Daniel, there's plenty of theologians who would want Daniel to stop and say, no, technically that's incorrect. It's not holy gods, it's one God, and the spirit's not in me. But have you ever run into that? Where someone's more interested in correcting someone else on the technicalities than actually building a bridge on common ground? And I think one of the beautiful things that Daniel does is he doesn't fight over the technicalities. You know, one of the phrases I hear all the time as a pastor, when someone dies, people will say to me, oh, God needed another angel, right? Now, theologically, that's wrong, right? People don't become angels when they die. I hate to disappoint any of you here who might even think that. But I can promise you, when a family member who's grieving says that to me, I don't think it's the right occasion to point out their theological inaccuracy. I think they're looking for language to see how God could be part of this. And I'm telling you that if you have the chance to interact about who God is, and you have the choice to correct someone's theological technicality or just build a bridge to a relationship of God's activity, choose the latter. Daniel does. Now, this gets pretty wild. So I'm going to fast forward through some of this story. Daniel interprets it correctly. This is a weird, wild dream. You'll totally want to read it for yourself. He gets a prominent spot in the kingdom, and then one problem, the king dies. New king, Daniel chapter 5. This king comes on. His dad was Nebuchadnezzar, so he knew who Daniel was. He's throwing a party at one point, and get this, there's handwriting that shows up on the wall. Guess who he calls to interpret the handwriting? Daniel. Daniel interprets it. He gets it right. And then he gives Daniel some accolades and gives him now back a prominent place in the kingdom. One problem. That king dies. And I don't know if you've ever felt like this. Like, hey, I think I was actually making progress. I was being faithful to God, and I see the blessing of God, but then the circumstances aren't working out the way I think they're supposed to. My ticket keeps dying. Then comes Darius, Daniel chapter 6, the next king. Now, he had seen what Daniel had done, and so he actually puts Daniel in a group of 3 people who's in charge of a group of 120 people who are in charge of the kingdom. The 120 people are called satraps, and they're a little bitter that Daniel has this position over them. Here's how the story goes. It says, now Daniel had so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They don't want Daniel in charge of them, so they're looking, where did Daniel screw up? Where did he mess up? Where did he cut a corner? Where did he do wrong? So that we can show that to the king, and then he won't be in charge of us. But they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. If you happen to work in an environment where you're a follower of Jesus, but the people around you, maybe your boss, aren't followers of Jesus, I might suggest to you that the very best version of your Christian witness is this. That you in that workplace be neither corrupt nor negligent. When everyone else takes a kickback, you don't take a kickback. When everyone else pads the expenses, you don't pad the expenses. When everyone else tells a white lie to kind of make their way forward, you don't tell the white lie to make your way forward. That as the representative of your God in that setting, integrity is everything. That you would be the one person in that workplace who couldn't even be accused because you do everything above board. And not only not corrupt, but not negligent. That actually, because you're the follower of Christ, you come in early. You don't skate in late. You perform at the highest levels, not the minimum levels. You don't surf Facebook on company time. You're the kind of person that distinguishes themselves not just as an accountant, but one of the best accountants. Not just as an attorney, but one of the best attorneys. Not just as one of the maids, but the best maid. That's who you are because you represent God in the midst of that. And it's so fascinating that because they couldn't find any reason to accuse Daniel, they didn't then decide on an opposite strategy. We're actually, get this, going to use his integrity against him. They know that he won't compromise. And so this is their new plan. We'll get the king to pass a little law that says anybody who prays to anybody but the king gets thrown into the lion's den. Here's what we know about Daniel. He's not going to follow that law. We've watched Daniel. He goes up to his room 3 times a day, windows open, and he prays. This is like the perfect trap to be set. And so the decree gets issued. In their day, it was a decree that got issued that could not be rescinded. Daniel knew of the decree, and here's what happened. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. This wasn't a new thing. He wasn't showing off now that there was a prayer decree. This was actually an old thing for Daniel. It's how he had always lived, and he was not going to change the way he lived. Now, I think this is a fascinating situation if we all try to put ourselves in his shoes. Actually, if I could be honest, I think it's a fascinating situation if one of you were in his shoes and you came and asked me as your pastor, what should I do? Because there's a part of me that would say, oh, that's a tough one. You're going to go to the lion's den just for saying your prayers like you always did? I might even suggest to you, hey, still say the prayers, but close the windows. But there's something about it. Just saying, God, I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm not going to be ashamed of it, even when it's going to cost me something. I don't know many ways that you have a more powerful Christian witness that represents God well than when you do the tough thing, even when it will cost you. And so they accuse him. They go back to the king. The king actually wishes he had never issued the decree, but he can't rescind it. And so in kind of an odd scenario, he's going to throw Daniel into the den with lions and at the same time wish he wasn't. In fact, here's what happens. Get this. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Who's praying to Daniel's God now? The king. You see, that's how this works. And then, if you know the story, the supernatural work of God happens. The lions do not, in unbelievable fashion, do not attack Daniel. They come open up the pit the next day, and Daniel comes walking out. And here's where we get close to the end of the story of Daniel. The king says, I issue a new decree, a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He says, I don't know if you've noticed this, but kings die. Our dominion ends. What I've seen about this man as he lived his faith out in the midst of an environment that did not honor his faith, it's turned me to his faith. He rescues, this God rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. And so, if I could briefly, let me just kind of bullet point a few things that I see Daniel teach us, model for us, about how to live as what I'll call an exile. If you happen to live in an environment, maybe you live in a home, and the other people in your home are not followers of Jesus, what do you do? Maybe you go to work, and at work, the people who are in your workplace, they're not followers of Jesus. What do you do? Maybe you work among a younger generation. You work at a school. You have students, and they don't follow Jesus like the last 2 generations followed Jesus. What do you do? Well, here's what you do. Ask yourself if you do this. Live as an exile. You got to be different, but not obnoxious. If you just live like everyone else lives, if there's no distinction at all, that doesn't shine any light on who our God is. But if the way you're different is actually obnoxious to people, if it's not winsome, if it's not with tact or wisdom, that's not helpful either. Second, don't compromise your way of life. And then this is very important. And don't condemn theirs. This is where power Christianity gets in trouble. Power Christianity means Christians are in charge, and we can impose our way of life and say everyone ought to live that way. Christianity that's the underdog has to live in the opposite way, and it's the healthy way. That says, hey, I'm not going to compromise how I live. I'm not going to drink the wine. I'm not going to bow down. I'm still going to say my prayers, even if it costs me. That's what I'm doing. I'm not compromising. But I don't stand in judgment of your way of life. When you don't even worship the God that I worship, I wouldn't expect you to live according to my way of life unless you embraced my God. And so I'm not trying to change anybody's behavior. I'm trying to show them who my God is with hopes they'll embrace him. If you live as an exile, you have to be a bridge builder. You're looking for all the places to connect, all the places to tell the story of your God, all the places to speak for God, all the places you have common ground with someone. Not a bridge burner. It's all about engaging the relationship. And when you're living as an exile, you take every opportunity there is to speak of God. Because as lame as it is to be a person who's obnoxious about their faith, it is equally lame to not give your God any credit at all. And so, Suncrest, I pray that as we live out our witness, if you're a follower of Jesus in this world, that you would always remember you represent God. And if you represent him well, you could be used by him to change lives. And I pray for that right now. God, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for your faithfulness to us. Thank you for hearing our prayers and answering them. Thank you for giving us opportunities through the highs in our life, and I see even more through the lows in our life. That the way we carry ourselves, the way that we trust you, the way that we obey you, doesn't just say something about who we are. It says something about who you are. In Christ's name, amen.